So what I want to do is dive into the Indo-Greeks, which I think you're probably more of a fan of, right?
Certainly more than philosophy. I think the Indo-Greeks are probably the most fascinating topic I've ever covered. And to kind of give a background on this, because there's quite a bit. So, kind of quick aside. In the conquest of Alexander the Great, his army reached the Punjab, the modern-day Punjab, the land of the five rivers. And that is the farthest extent they ever had reached. Eventually, they left and returned back to Babylon. But there were Greek governors that were left behind who were eventually killed. And then the rise of Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire, basically retook much of that control and extended it to Afghanistan, where there was kind of an understanding between Chandragupta and Alexander's successor in the east, Seleucus. From there, after the fall, the Greeks had established themselves in Afghanistan, in much of Central Asia, known as Bactria and Sogdiana in antiquity. A very wealthy land, very prosperous. We know almost not very little about it. It's only preserved in coin finds and whatnot. These Greeks eventually asserted independence from Seleucus's heirs and established what is called the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom. We don't know if they've ever fought Chandragupta, or rather the Mauryan Empire. It is very unlikely that they did. But by about 185 BC, after the fall of the Mauryan dynasty and the rise of the Shunga dynasty of Brihadratha, you have here Greco-Bactrian kings, namely Demetrius I. He and his ilk crossed the Hindu Kush mountain range, entered into southern Afghanistan, into modern Pakistan, where they invaded and established control. This control eventually was a breakaway kingdom of sorts from Bactria. Bactria had fallen to the arrival of nomads from the steppes. So think of your, proto-Mongol kind of peoples had migrated into Afghanistan and taken over there. But the Greeks who lived in northwestern India and parts of Pakistan stayed there for the next 200 years or so. This kingdom lasted effectively from 185 BC until approximately 10 AD, so nearly 200 years. And it was the final king. We don't know who it exactly was, but we know the coin evidence suggests it. We have very little written evidence about it. But this was the kind of the history of these Indo-Greek rulers. And they're so incredibly fascinating simply because we have so little to go off of them in terms of written information, in terms of stories and ideas. We have bits and pieces from both Greek sources, mainly in the form of coins, but also from Indian sources. So you have texts for like Patanjali, which is a great grammarian of the 2nd century BC, who talks about the invasion of what they call the Yavanas or Yonas. So this is a term that derives from the Persian word Yoana, or rather, let me phrase that back. Yona or Yavana is derived from the Persian word for Ionian, which is the Greeks who lived in Ionia on the eastern part of the western part of the empire. And you have these little bits and pieces here where you see Greeks adopting, or at least patronizing many local traditions, be they Buddhist or Hindu Vedic. You have the building of temples and whatnot, and it's such an incredibly fascinating topic that not many people know about, or it's very poorly understood. But you get these little nuggets that come through and just makes you wish we had more information is being found each and every day. But we found a bunch of top actually information this year, but with everything going on, it's always hard to study in Central Asia and Pakistan just because of the political climates and natural disasters and whatnot. So hopefully we eventually will continue to find our research in there.
What's funny? I'm actually impressed by all the dates you mentioned, like that you actually remember it. That's what I'm actually impressed.
Writing aloud, you have to remember these dates. They're not set, and the funny thing is, those are dates that are not set in stone. Those are what
Yeah,
we generally agree on. Those are what we have an idea of. But
yeah.
the dates are very loose, unfortunately, just
It's
because
like
we
a
don't have
rough
many
idea of
records.
when it happened, basically.
Exactly, correct.
Yeah. Okay. It's interesting. I don't know if you know this, but like obviously, like when Alexander the Great, like his horse Bucephalus, when it died, he had a city named after it, Bucephalia, right?
One of the many cities allegedly founded by Alexander. Ancient sources claim it was upwards of 70, but I wouldn't put it that. But One of the traditions is that the death of his beloved horse Bucephalus after the battle of the Hydaspes against King
Yeah,
Porus or Parava, he did establish a city, as far as we know. What that city eventually became, or if it stayed long term, we don't know. But it is one of the
I
cities
was
allegedly of Greek rule.
yeah, I was gonna mention because there is a city actually in Pakistan, and it's called Falia, which supposedly it comes from Bucephalia.
It would be an interesting. It would be an interesting etymology, that's for sure. I am not familiar with this, but if I could have added it to my upcoming book, hopefully I can do that. But I mean, you
Yeah,
do get bits and pieces of it. I mean, for example, in the city of Kandahar or the region of Kandahar in Afghanistan, there's this old part of the city where you have the like this mess or like plateau with the remains of this former city. In antiquity, this was partially known as Alexandria. So you have this possible transliteration where the name Alexandros got transferred to the Bactrian or even Iranian Iskandar, and then eventually
yeah,
Kandahar. They don't know that for sure, but it's something that it fits nicely. But
yeah,
it's again, it's more we have to discover and research into this transmission of history.
yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I do know since like fortunately I do speak like Hindi and Urdu, so like I do know that the name for Alexander is Sikandar in like Urdu and Hindi. Yeah.
Mm.
So I mean, I could kind of see like how it kind of relates.
It's always that's always a tricky thing. I mean, as much as we love etymology, and so did the ancients, how they describe things, it is oftentimes a tenuous connection. For
Yeah,
example, in India and Pakistan, there was a city at the time known as to the Greeks as Pukeolotus, which I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but people oftentimes think it might be the same city as what the Indian sources call Pushkalavati. Is it similar? Who knows? But it's something to consider.
yeah,
And we're always searching for any little possible connection because there's so little to draw upon. But it is a possibility, and it's something again. More research is always in demand.
yeah. Oh, that's interesting. So I was gonna bring back the point to the Battle of Hydaspes and like that city of Falia is what's interesting is that I found this out like recently is that in that like city apparently there's like a statue of like a horse and it's supposed to be attributed to Alexander the Great and like Bucephalus, which I found to be like very interesting. That like
You know,
there's like tribute even after like all these like years.
yeah, no, that's always a interesting idea. I mean, at the same time, when you have these, oftentimes, I believe there's examples of modern Afghan peoples who will claim that they are the descendants of
Yeah,
Alexander's men, the Macedonians. And same thing, and there was a village in China a few years back that got some sort of recognition, claiming to be the heirs to the lost legion of the Roman consul Marcus Licinius Crassus. Um, how can you prove this? It's very difficult. But if they believe in it, it does attest to that cultural memory, or at least the longing to link oneself to that cultural memory, seeing how they value it, or at least maybe it's something they're trying to do to appeal to some sort of historical basis. It's very hard to
yeah,
say. I always cast skepticism over it, but that's what they oftentimes say.
yeah. No, no, I feel you because obviously like I'm not implying that that's actually like real or whatever. But
Mm,
it's just like interesting because you mentioned like the people that claim to be descendants, right? I don't know if you've heard of like the Kalash people, supposedly like they claim
mhm.
to be like descendants of Alexander the Great because they do look a
There,
bit different, I guess.
yeah, the Kalash people do. I've read where they have certain physical appearances that would suggest maybe of European ancestry. Central Asia is very complicated when it comes
Yeah.
to populations and ethnic origins and identities. If this is what they have attributed themselves, it's not unlike how the modern Hungarians oftentimes or traditionally Hungarians have linked themselves to Attila the Hun. How similar they are in a in similarities, it's unclear, but always linking oneself to like a legendary hero or figure that's been repeated in history time immemorial. So it is an interesting idea. It does sort of fit the area. But again, it's something you have to leave to skepticism. But hey, if there's any figure to draw from, Alexander and his army would be definitely one if you're trying to assert your valor or assert your martial ability.
Yeah, no, that's true, 100%. So obviously, we do know the establishment of like the Indo-Greeks, and I guess in a way, like the reason why Buddhism like thrived and like essentially spread out to most of the world, like in East Asia and whatnot. So I'm sure you're probably aware of like how there's like a statue of Buddha and there's like a statue of Hercules as well, like kind of like embodying that they somehow belong in that same like world.
That's probably one of the most interesting aspects I've done research for. Now, the Indo Greeks, I mean, Buddhism had been established in much of northwestern India and parts of Central Asia for a few hundred years, or about 100, 200 years prior to their arrival. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka the Great was famously either a major convert or a patron of Buddhism and helped it send missionaries out to northwards to Central Asia. One of the consequences later on, so in about the second and late first to third centuries AD, so about 150, 200 years after the fall of the Greek or the Indo-Greeks, you have this flourishing artistic tradition that forms in the region known as Gandhara, which is parts of northwestern Pakistan and into southern Afghanistan. This was a prominent Buddhist sanctuary, like center, where it was a very prominent religion, and local craftsmen produce these beautiful works of stone carvings and reliefs that show almost entirely Buddhist stories. You have the birth of the Buddha, his ascension to nirvana, his generally topics such as that. But what you also see from this period is not only the appearance of Buddha, but also figures that very much are similar to those found in contemporary Roman and Greek art. Like you mentioned previously, Heracles, the god Heracles, the club wielding demigod of strength.
Yeah.
Um, he is probably the most famous example of this because he does appear to is apparently in the art of these Gandharan artists alongside the Buddha. Um, the reason why you can sort of see this is because his muscular physique, bushy beard, a club, which is probably the most dead giveaway, and oftentimes a lion skin. These are all present in these Buddhist reliefs. Now, there needs to be a caveat on this because it's not necessarily that they believe that Heracles was with Buddha, and Heracles is clearly in this role, or at least the image of Heracles is being deployed as a protector image. So, in the context of Buddhist mythology, there is the Vajrapani, the one who wields the Vajra, which is a thunderbolt. In prior to this art, the Vajra looks like it looks like it's held in the middle of the hand and it's two large oblong ends. If you can easily see how this would eventually can be transformed into a club or a clubbing weapon, and Gandhara is where the Greeks ruled for quite a few hundred years. It is very possible that they drew inspiration from these memory of the god Heracles, who was very popular among the Greco-Bactrians. We have coins with Heracles on him. We have statues. We have this image of martial power of exemplified by Heracles. And if you're going to have someone protect the Buddha and fight demons and whatnot, then Heracles would be a good example to draw from. But this is not replicated in any other art prior to this. The connections are very much there. And eventually, this image of the club wielding Vajrapani Heracles is transmitted to East Asia. And you lose the Heraclean aspects, but some things still bleed through. And this is carried all the way to Japan. It's so fascinating. And there's so many other aspects of Gandharan art or Gandharan art that you see this connection between the two. Ultimately, kind of summing up my point, you have local Indian and South Asian craftsmen who are able to adopt and appropriate aspects of Greco-Roman and classical art and transform it into traditionally South Asian or Indian perspective by incorporating into the stories of the Buddha. They are taken from the Greek context and placed in a new one to create entirely something new. And it's so fascinating to see these in person. I've had the luxury of seeing these works of art, and you pointed out, and it's incredible to witness.
Yeah, no, I think I was fortunate enough, as you mentioned, in the Chicago Museum. I think I might have seen it there actually.
There's a couple pieces in the South Asian section. One famous example, it shows the Buddha and his entourage, and right behind them it's Heracles wielding a club and the bushy beard. It's unmistakable that it is that character. It's I would love to have been able to see some of these more fascinating statues. However, unfortunately, they're kind of dispersed all over the world, as it were. These were very popular for European colonial empires because they were so similar to Greek and Roman art that they thought, well, there must be a connection. It's Greek artists or it's Roman craftsmen or whatever it might be. Likely, it is the skill of these local Indian craftsmen, but they had such an affinity for this Greek and Roman tradition that they were willing to incorporate it into their own style.
Interesting. Well, you remember how I told you about, I was going to bring you back to Socrates. So, actually, funny enough, so, we obviously mentioned that, the Indians and the Greeks obviously had some form of like connection, I guess. And there was contact, obviously. But even like during the time of Socrates, there's supposedly um, like basically like someone from India comes and like he basically challenges some of Socrates' ideas. And this is like something I was reading, and I was just like, wow, like even like from back then, like before Alexander the Great, there was a form of contact.
There is this theory. I don't have the exact term for it, but the idea that at approximately the same time period in Mediterranean, in India, and in China, there was this near simultaneous rise of philosophical ideals and thinkers. In Greece, you have Socrates, as you mentioned. In the West, or in India, you have the Buddha, for example, and in China, you have Confucius. There have been theories that's been posed that possibly the Greeks and the Indian art philosophers had influenced either one or another prior to this period. However, it's not generally accepted in the mainstream. But there is an interesting possibility that when Alexander and his entourage arrived, there was this exchange of ideas between both Greeks and Indian philosophers. For example, at the same time as Alexander, one of his companions was a man named Pyrrho of Elis. It is said, in at least in one tradition, he had spoken to a peoples called the Gymnosophists. This in Greek literally translates to naked wise men, and this is when he was in his time in India. When Pyrrho returned to the Mediterranean, he started preaching ideas that eventually became known as Pyrrhonian skepticism. The long and short of it is that many of his ideas and his teachings sound very much similar to the ideas expressed by Buddhists. And there's a theory that in his conversations with these Buddhists, Pyrrho had somehow transported many of these ideas and re-articulated them in a Greek fashion into into the Greek fashion to introduce to the Greek world. And this eventually led to the development of certain other philosophical schools. But that's one possibility. As we mentioned as well, Greek stories have been transplanted to Buddhist contexts as well. And we know that for a fact, Greek philosophy to some extent was probably practiced at least we know for sure in Afghanistan. We have found papyrus fragments of philosophical texts that are otherwise unknown to us, which indicates they probably were writing them there. And it's very likely that they continued to do this practice when they moved to India instead. And probably the most famous example is the story known as the Milinda Panya. This translates roughly to this is a Pali text, which translates to the questions of King Milinda. And it's basically a story of how this Yona king named Milinda challenges the Buddhist sage Nagasena to essentially, articulate the views, why is Buddhism the right path rather. And then by the end of the story, after Nagasena talks about the teachings of the Buddha and convinces the king then converts to Buddhism and becomes a saint, Arahat. Now, what scholars have noticed is that Melinda is almost certainly the Indo-Greek king Menander. And older scholars believe that this dialogue was based on some sort of Greek original because it was so similar to Plato's like Socratic dialogues, where you have this back and forth where the king would pose a series of questions to this philosopher, or in this case Nagasena, and Nagasena would answer and articulate further and spur on more conversation. It's an interesting theory. The Indian philosophy has always had this back and forth structure. I mean, we call it Socratic dialogue, but really it's also spawned in other places outside of Greece. But it could be, and this was written a few hundred years after Menander's death. But at the same time, it does indicate that the Greeks and Indians are going with each other to some extent, and probably engaging in philosophical dialogues. We just unfortunately don't have much to go off of, and that's the sad part. Is where can we, if we can find more connecting the two, then fantastic. Otherwise, we just have these nuggets that hint at something greater, but nothing more we can go on to on that end.
That's one of the great things about history, that there's always more to discover, because and it's just so mysterious that like one small thing can lead to another.